From 1947 to 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union were embroiled in the Cold War, a struggle between two superpowers for military supremacy. Tensions between the two countries provided the background for the 1961 establishment of the Defense Intelligence Agency and would exert a formative influence on the first 3 decades of the agency. DIA was never more front and center than in 1981 when pages of intelligence reports related to the Soviet Union were released.
35,000 copies all over the country.
Growth of their armed forces was remarkable.
It was a time of change.
We saw what was going on. We took note of it. We thought, like the old Buffalo Springfield song, something's happening here.
Possibility exists that, we actually were going to come to blows.
For such reports, large amounts of it formally classified to leave the secretive walls of the U.S. intelligence community was very unusual.
It was unusual because it was something that was coming out that was unclassified.
It broke all the rules of intelligence tradecraft, yet the order had come from the highest levels of U.S. government.
The Secretary of Defense and the President wanted this word out.
This was a means to educate the American public as to what we believed from the intelligence was the capabilities and nature and intent of the Soviet Union in regard to its international affairs, especially using military power to gain the upper hand.
The President wanted people to understand what the nature of the threat was from the Soviet Union and, to a lesser degree, its Warsaw Pact allies.
Soviets presented a unique threat in that they had such an all-encompassing devotion to producing weapon systems. They had a Typhoon-class submarine that carried 16 missiles that was almost 2 football fields long. That's as long as a cruiser. They had new aircraft, both fighters and bombers, new long-range missile systems, and there had to be a way to present that to the American public.
The Secretary of Defense and the President wanted this word out.
To get the word out, the United States Department of Defense launched a publication in 1981 called Soviet Military Power. Prepared by the order of the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and produced by DIA, Soviet Military Power detailed the Soviet military armed forces' intent, capabilities, and strategy.
Soviet military power is one of the most important documents the Department of Defense has ever produced.
The purpose of this publication was to inform people about the military might of the Soviet Union.
They would negotiate, but they negotiated from great strength, and they were not afraid to throw that power around.
Here we had a way to be able to let people know, both in the United States and in Europe and in the Soviet Union and in the Warsaw Pact, just what the disparity was between Soviet forces and Western forces.
The first edition of Soviet Military Power was published in September 1981 during the height of the Cold War.
The enthusiasm with which they were received was so great that within 2 or 3 months we had to go back to the printing plant and probably do, I think the figure was another 250,000. They were very, very popular.
It was received with widened eyes and open mouths and a lot of excitement. We found that there was an enormous demand for this publication. This was intelligence with a big bang.
It was a one-and-done book for the longest time. And we often wondered, well, that's a nice effort. Let's see, maybe we'll do it again sometime, maybe we won't.
Blessed by the President, Soviet Military Power returned to the presses 14 months after its first publication for an Oval Office release.
President Reagan released this in the Oval Office, speaking about its importance with Secretary Weinberger behind him.
And even President Reagan had been known to thumb through it. In a few times I went to the White House in the Oval Office, they made sure there was one lying on the coffee table, so I knew it had gone that far.
Little did we know, a year later we'd start a second one, and a third, and a fourth, and it came out annually.
Every year we saw something new, and that meant that every year we had to put out something so that the public knew about it.
In the national security world, and obviously the media world, this was a must-have document.
Always a great thing to see the right portrayal of your work showing up in the press.
And what we found was that our allies were so impressed that they started volunteering such information as that they were gathering to assist us with each new edition. It was an alliance product. People just said, wow, for the first time we can talk authoritatively, and we can plan authoritatively, and we can work authoritatively based on this information.
Military power, military leadership, the doctrine and strategy, to have our cutting-edge analysis be put into this document for the public. It was really a fabulous thing to work on.
Having something that actually was out there, that came out from the Secretary of Defense, and represented cumulative man-years worth of effort was something that we were very proud of.
Soviet military power contained large amounts of formerly classified information.
We would write it at the highest levels of classification so that it would have actual information, detail in it about the Soviet armed forces. Then we would spread that draft around the entire intelligence community and say, what do you think? Is there something in here that really gives you pain that shouldn't be in here? And when that was done, we would publish it, instantly declassified as Soviet military power.
The emphasis was on accuracy, but also making sure that the information that we had was truly either unclassified or declassified.
One of the most unique characteristics of Soviet military power was the artwork used in the publication. From 1965 to 1989, DIA maintained a staff of artists to prepare paintings and illustrations on Soviet military systems.
Many of those illustrations are paintings, and the reason they're paintings was because we couldn't get the photographs declassified because of the source that the photograph came from, but we could do an artist's rendition of what that photograph depicted.
If you walk the halls of DIA, I'm sure you still see reproductions of these four-color paintings from Soviet military power, and you look at them and you look at the detail of those paintings. These are amazing illustrations.
Soviet military power efforts involved hundreds of DIA analysts, printers, writers, editors, and graphic artists that were vital to the project.
You didn't necessarily get to work on Soviet military power right away. It was like a badge of honor to be able to get the right to have your work published in Soviet military power. So it was quite an honor to get picked to even work on the document.
At its peak in 1987, 400,000 copies of Soviet military power were printed. It was translated into 8 different languages, including Russian.
The reason that we published it in Russian was to send it off to Moscow so that people over there could take a look at it.
Izvestia branded it 99 pages of lies, at the same time that the New York Times was praising the very first edition as incredibly important.
They were apoplectic. They had never seen anything like this. They had never seen a public diplomacy display on their forces and their policies and their leaders and their doctrine and their industry at the unclassified level to the extent that they saw in Soviet military power.
There was opposition in both within other parts of the U.S. intelligence community and amongst some of our allies that we were overinflating the size of the Soviet chemical threat, Soviet chemical weapons stockpile, etc. It was amusing to note that when the Soviet Union collapsed and we finally were able to get in and do some on-site analysis and visits, we found out that as massive as we had said the Soviet chemical warfare stockpile was only a fraction of what they actually had.
In 1989, prospects for change. We see things are changing in the Soviet Union. We captured what happened with Gorbachev taking over. We captured the aspects of what they call the new defensive doctrine of reasonable sufficiency. No longer a doctrine to fight and win. We won't shoot until we're attacked. Quite a change. We looked at their economy, which seemed to be going downhill. Military production seemed to be slowing.
What we were seeing with the Soviet military doctrine was just sort of the beginning of a change. And the beginning of what ended up being the unraveling of the Soviet Union.
The destruction of the Berlin Wall, the unification of the two Germanys, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union marked the end of the Cold War. The confrontation of the two nuclear-armed superpowers had lasted nearly 50 years. Soviet military power highlighted this struggle for a decade. Its influence and reach in the end came from surprising places.
When Secretary of Defense was Richard Cheney, he went over for a counterpart visit of Minister of Defense Yazov. And Yazov took him into the Defense Committee of the Duma, the parliament of the Soviet Union, and a member stood up waving our Russian language edition of Soviet military power and shouting at Yazov, the Soviet defense minister, why is it that we have to depend on the Americans for information on our own armed forces?
The impact of Soviet military power was enormous, far beyond what anyone had anticipated.
Soviet military power had a key role to play in garnering public support within the United States and amongst our allies for ramping up the efforts to try and bring the Cold War to an end on terms that were favorable to us. If someone had asked me in 1984 when I arrived at DIA whether or not 7 years in the future there would no longer be a Warsaw Pact or no longer be a Soviet Union, I would have laughed at him and said there's no chance that's going to happen. But I do think that Soviet military power played an important role in getting the American people to understand the threat that we faced and the work that was going to be necessary in order to be able to overcome that.
I have such pride in this agency from having had that opportunity to work on Soviet military power.
By putting forth a publication like Soviet Military Power and having it so well received, it put DIA in the forefront. It was a contributor to bringing DIA into the big leagues.
Soviet military power was an enormous information operation. We were taking information and turning it to our strategic, conventional, and tactical advantage with the publication of Soviet military power.
Soviet military power and its impact endure. Its lessons can even be applied by today's intelligence professionals.
That analysts should be instructed to look at these documents when they're coming in and learning their work in whatever new fields they're working in. Look at these unclassified documents, understand that they are declassified documents, and understand that they help to shape the world.